Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to dive into neuropharmacology, or basically drugs in your brain. So we're going to learn about drugs, yes, but we're going to learn about really how they affect neurotransmitters and synapses and why they are not good, which you should already know. So there's a number of ways that drugs can affect the brain, but there's really sort of 5 big ones, and the drugs that we're going to talk about all fall into this sort of breakdown of 5 possible effects. So the first is that they either increase or decrease the release of neurotransmitters. So from the presynaptic end to the postsynaptic, the postsynaptic end of the first neuron to the presynaptic end of the second neuron, whether those neurotransmitters are increasing or decreasing, or the proteins which are responsible for returning used components like used dopamine or other used hormones. Those proteins maybe are getting broken down. They block the reuptake protein, so these proteins that are on the presynaptic neuron that would like take whatever the hormones or neurotransmitters are that are coming back in, they block them off. They mimic or block neurotransmitters, so they like fake out the neurons being like, yes, I am dopamine, but it's actually not. It's a drug, so it like forces whatever the typical reaction may be, right? Dopamine, serotonin, all these are like feel good hormones in our body, but maybe the drugs are like mimicking that. And then inhibiting production of new neurotransmitters, so preventing additional neurotransmitters from being able to be passed along through the synapse. There's 2 important neurotransmitters that we're going to be talking about. We'll be talking about this kind of throughout the rest of this. So cholinergic synapses, they use acetylcholine, causes depolarization of the postsynaptic neuron. So acetylcholine is involved in the parasympathetic system. So these types of drugs will make you feel relaxed, make you feel like you don't have a care in the world, but they do this by causing a depolarization. And then adrenergic synapses use noradrenaline, which again, both of these, acetylcholine and noradrenaline, are neurotransmitters that depolarizes the next neuron, but this is involved in the sympathetic nervous system. So this is like, I'm sure you've like kind of put this together, but noradrenaline is adrenaline, so it's in the fight or flight system. So this is like gives you the opposite effect. So this gives you like alertness and energy, makes you feel more like, I don't know, just like alive, I guess, makes you feel like you can see what's going on, right? So that would be an example of a stimulant, right? Something that stimulates your fight or flight. It gives you adrenaline. It makes you feel like more awake. An example of that would be like cocaine or amphetamines or nicotine. And these are things that I'm sure you've heard of. You might have even done like projects on them in health, but maybe not to the extent of the neurotransmitters involved in the brain, which, okay, that's fine. And then, so on the flip side of a stimulant is a sedative. So decreased neurotransmission, benzodiazepines like Valium, alcohol, THC, like marijuana. Again, I'm sure you've heard of these. You might have heard of them as like depressives, or maybe I'm aging myself by calling it that, but that's what it was called when I was in school. But we're going to call them sedatives and stimulants for the purpose of this set of notes. So we're going to go through all 6 of those, and then at the end we're going to talk about one sort of like, not bonus, but like bonus drug, one that gets focused on a lot for IB. So let's start with cocaine. So cocaine blocks the reuptake pumps, right? So the dopamine stays in this sort of synapse, right? This open area. And because dopamine can't be taken back up, there's no like signal that like we've had enough dopamine, and so dopamine just continues to be released, and so you get a summative increase in the postsynaptic transmission. Because this is blocked, the pre-neuron will just be like, oh, wow, we apparently need like a ton of dopamine. Let me continue making it. And it will just continuously push out dopamine because there's no signal saying stop. And so the effects of this are pleasure, euphoria, increased energy and alertness. It's highly addictive. You see this a lot in like movies. Like if you ever saw like Wolf of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio, like this is like a highly addictive drug. And it makes you really alert, so you can like focus in on like, I don't know, work or something, but it's so addictive. And as soon as like the effects of the cocaine wear off, it is highly associated with depression, and you actually reduce the production of dopamine on your own over time. So like you, as someone who just exists in the world, would have a reduced production of dopamine. So unless you are on cocaine, you're not getting these feelings of like pleasure naturally. Like typically if you like see a puppy, you might have dopamine released in your brain because you're like, oh my god, cute puppy. But if you were addicted to cocaine, then the amount of dopamine that would have been produced when you saw that puppy would be reduced. Nicotine, found in cigarettes, right? Mimics acetylcholine. This causes a calming effect. You typically will hear people who are addicted to cigarettes say, oh, I just need to like take a breather. I'm just going to go out and like smoke a cigarette, or like after dinner, like they always go out and smoke a cigarette. If you don't know anyone who smokes cigarettes, good. Keep it that way. Never start smoking. It's crazy addictive. I have enough friends that have become addicted that I can say that, so just stay away from it. And vaping. So anyways, causes a calming effect. So after acetylcholine is received by receptors, it's broken down by an enzyme that will break down acetylcholine. Acetylcholine esterase. So this ACE right here, we know that this is an enzyme. But that's a typical acetylcholine neurotransmitter. The enzyme cannot break down the nicotine molecules that bind to the same receptor. So we have these receptors here, and you'll see, yes, they're different colors, but the shape is the same, right? And so nicotine pretends to be acetylcholine and binds to that receptor, and the receptor is now just stuck with nicotine attached to it instead of acetylcholine. So this will excite the postsynaptic neuron because it has something in its receptors. So it's like, woo, like, let's go. And it will begin to fire, send its message, and it will release dopamine. Again, this is all like, you'll notice a trend that it's all like increasing the amount of like feel-good hormones like dopamine. This causes increased depolarization of the postsynaptic neuron, which means increased action potentials, which means that this message is getting sent and sent and sent and sent and sent because nicotine is saying, yeah, I'm here, like, keep going. I'm not going to leave anytime soon, and you can't break me down, which means I'm just chilling, and I'm going to continue to send these messages. Our third is amphetamines. This is like meth. Again, highly addictive. So this stimulates transmission at the adrenergic synapses. It acts by passing directly into the nerve cells that carry dopamine and noradrenaline. So, right, we see these neurotransmitters here, and they kind of like match up with the dopamine neurotransmitters, and they get sent out. They move directly into the vesicles with dopamine. So like the like meth, the addictive piece of taking amphetamines basically again pretends to be dopamine and gets released into the cleft, which is again this open area between the two neurons in the synapse. Normally the neurotransmitters would be broken down but amphetamines interfere with the breakdown, and so in the synapse you end up with high concentrations of both dopamine and noradrenaline, so you feel you have a lot of dopamine, which is that feel good, and you have a lot of noradrenaline, which is that like fight or flight response. So I'm sure you've seen TV shows or movies or something that like has someone who is addicted to methamphetamines in it, and so you've seen sort of like what that looks like in a person, and usually they are very alert, but after a certain amount of time, the release of dopamine does not have the same effect. So you're not seeing like a highly alert, like super happy person. They're usually like a little bit anxious, a little bit like looking over their shoulder all the time, not really sure what's going on, and that is just the long-term effect of someone who is sort of messing with what the expected outcome of the release of these neurotransmitters is. Okay, so those were our stimulants. Now we're going to go into our sedatives. So focusing in on benzodiazepine, which is like Valium. So we have a new neurotransmitter that we're going to talk about, GABA. You don't need to know what it stands for. You just need to know the word GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So GABA opens chloride ion channels on the postsynaptic membrane, which hyperpolarizes the neuron. So remember that we need to depolarize to like shoot up, but hyperpolarizing means that we're going down. So we're further and further away from that threshold that we would have needed to hit to cause an action potential. Now, Valium is something that can be prescribed in like a safe setting. So overtaking Valium is the issue here, right? But this is something that can be prescribed for anxiety, so reducing anxiety. And the way this works is you're increasing the binding of GABA to the postsynaptic membrane, so you're keeping those action potentials to a minimum, so you're not shooting off a bunch of like, oh my gosh, like things are around, like I'm concerned, I need to be thinking about this, I'm worrying about a lot of things. It depends on what your anxiety brings you as a person. A lot of people have different interactions with anxiety, but this is something that can be prescribed, but can definitely be overused as well. So alcohol, I know you've all heard of alcohol, again increases the binding of GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It decreases activity on glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, so it like makes it even more inhibitory. And by doing this, it increases the release of dopamine. So again, I'm sure you've seen someone who has taken alcohol at some point, either in a movie or a TV show, or maybe even in real life, which I don't know how you would because you're so young. But typically those that are drunk, taking too much alcohol, are very relaxed. They feel okay, but as you, I'm sure, know, I don't need to tell you, too much of anything is not a good thing. It impacts vision, mental awareness, it impacts everything. Basically, it is addictive. There are a lot of people that are addicted to alcohol because it does give a feeling of pleasure. The reward pathway is hit in this, and so it's really important to know that like the reason that you're increasing the release of dopamine here is because of these inhibitory neurotransmitters and the effect it has on other neurotransmitters that are existing in your body. Okay, and then marijuana. So dopamine release is actually monitored by GABA, so it's inhibited. If GABA is there, dopamine is not, sort of thing. So THC mimics, right, we talked about that on the first page, it mimics a different neurotransmitter called cannabinoids and inhibits GABA release by binding to that receptor, so GABA cannot inhibit dopamine release. So THC, again, binds to a receptor and blocks GABA, which is our normal neurotransmitter that is in our body. And by blocking GABA, dopamine just is like free-flowing, okay? It mimics an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This is bolded because you do actually need to know this neurotransmitter. Anandamide, which is thought to be involved in eliminating information from our memory that isn't needed. So, I'm sure, again, like, I'm sure you've heard of all this stuff. We're just doing a deeper dive. A lot of people will say, like, there are no effects of marijuana, like it's the healthiest drug, no long-term effects, there's been studies done. Okay, and I don't know, I have not kept up on any studies, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. However, it does mimic a specific neurotransmitter that eliminates information from our memory. So it does have some sort of an effect on our memory. Whether that is really long-term or not is still like sort of up for debate. I don't know. I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm just saying that it does have similar functions as a neurotransmitter normally found in our body. Now again, dopamine is released, so we have those feelings of pleasure, but the big kind of piece here is that marijuana may have an effect on learning, coordination, problem solving, memory, etc. And this would all be like long-term use. So like, I mean, don't do it. Don't do drugs, right? That's like a given. Don't do any of them. But this is all of these when I'm talking about like the effects is like extended use. So when I'm talking about extended use, I'm talking about addiction usually. So it's a dependence on a substance. It's repeated and compulsive use. You have to do it. You feel like you have to do it. It's actually a rewiring of your brain because in all of these, you've noticed that I said, oh, dopamine is released. Oh, you've blocked the uptake of dopamine so it stays available. Oh, you're hitting all these receptors so dopamine is available, right? Well, dopamine feels good. You like dopamine. Everybody likes the feeling of like a dopamine hit. Like I said, it's like seeing a puppy. Everybody likes seeing like cute things or seeing your favorite food after like a really long day. You just like that. And that's a dopamine hit. And so when you do something that causes an increase of dopamine enough times, your brain is like, that is cool. Like, let's keep doing that. And it rewires your brain to crave that feeling. And it leads you, as the human doing this, to an abuse of drugs. It leads to habits, and eventually tolerance of whatever level of drug you are taking, which means that you need to increase the dose of whatever drug it is to achieve the same effect, and that just leads to sort of like, it's just like a snowball, right? You're just snowballing out of control where you're doing more and more drugs just to get the same feeling that you had at the beginning. Now, withdrawal is the opposite of that, right? So that's stopping taking drugs and it's like a hard fall. So it's the opposite of euphoria, usually anxiety, depression, craving the drugs. It's super hard to do. It has physical, mental reactions. There's a lot of people that, go to rehab and then they leave rehab and they relapse, or they get really, really sick in rehab because your body is now like, it's finally hitting the low that you have been avoiding for potentially years. So there are many severe reactions. Alcohol withdrawal in particular can sometimes have fatal symptoms when you stop drinking. If you've been drinking a lot for a long time, it can actually kill you to stop, which is why rehab is so, so, so important to like wean you off and make sure that it's like a safe place to be going through this. So risk factors factors that can increase risk of addiction. There's social factors, right? Peer pressure. If drugs are cheap, poverty usually increases the risk. Traumatic life experiences, you just want to forget something. Young people who have behavior problems or mental health problems, cultural traditions, and there's also genetic risk factors. So, like alcoholism is genetic. So people who have parents that have like an addictive issue, whether it's with alcohol or certain drugs, that can actually be passed on. People who suffer from depression or anxiety sometimes feel that like taking drugs is like a quick fix for this. There is no quick fix for that. Therapy, doing things legally is always probably better. But some of these things are very hard. And whether you're talking socially or you're talking mental health or whatever is happening in your life, I urge you to find someone to talk to. And we'll leave it at that. So pain perception and endorphins. So pain. Okay, let's talk about pain now. So pain is perceived when impulses pass from pain receptors in the body to sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. From there, endorphins are released by the pituitary gland during stress or injury or exercise and act as painkillers by blocking pain perception. The pleasure pathway is faster than the pain pathway in the body. So when you feel pain, if you can think of something pleasurable, the pleasure pathway will block actually the pain from getting to your brain, and so you don't feel it quite as severely. So they do this by binding and blocking receptors at synapses. The pleasure pathway does this, used in the perception of pain. So that's like sort of what I was just talking about. Pleasure moves faster than pain. So if you feel pain and then you quickly think of something that's like really nice, like for me, I would like look at a picture of my dog, that pleasurable feeling of like seeing my cute little puppy would block the pain. So anesthetics is like anesthesia, right? So this blocks nerve transmission to pain centers in the central nervous system. So it's literally inserting something into the spine to interfere with the normal message sending to the brain. So they interfere with gated ion channels. They block the channel where sodium would normally go through. And then general anesthetics either modify the function of the gated channel or bind directly to the channel. It just prevents this transmission to actually occur. Okay, and our last thing that we're going to talk about is MDMA, aka ecstasy, and serotonin. So serotonin is basically dopamine. It's a feel-good neurotransmitter. So MDMA causes extra serotonin to be released. That's sort of like what it does. When you take ecstasy, you're releasing serotonin. However, you knew there was going to be something. So you get extra serotonin. You get like a really great feeling. It's actually like almost a better pleasure pathway than dopamine, serotonin is. And however, when the receptors catch up and remove MDMA, it's like depression like you've never seen before. So this happens a lot at like raves and shows. You'll see a lot of people will be like taking an ecstasy pill or something. And if you've never been to one, then obviously you don't know that. But it happens a lot at like all-night raves. So those who take MDMA all night will eventually deplete their serotonin. So when you deplete your ability to create serotonin, this leaves those receptors empty. And so a theory is that dopamine then fills those receptors, and dopamine breaks down its products, which are toxic to serotonin-producing neurons, which means that you're killing or impairing the function of the brain cells, and you're also just sort of like making it so that you can't produce serotonin in the future because dopamine has literally killed or broken down your ability to make serotonin. So this is, so if we're like looking at this, so right, we have our serotonin transporter receptor, so the purple is the serotonin, it's coming out, it's coming in here, and usually it just gets passed on, but when you do this too much and you have too much serotonin coming out, dopamine is like, hey, I can be a part of this too, and then dopamine is like, haha, just kidding, I'm gonna kill you. So again, moral of this set of notes is don't do drugs, and you do need to know about all of the 7 that we talked about. So the sedatives and the stimulants that were spoken about in this, you do need to know how each of them work and how they affect the brain in their specific way. You don't need to know, you can use all the abbreviations that I used in explanations. You do not need to know what any of them like really stand for, except for the one that is in marijuana. You do need to know the bolded word. Okay, we're going to talk a lot more about drugs and their effect on the brain in class, but good job, and I'll see you next time.